Hello, folks. Welcome to Philosophy Hall, where we discuss all things academic and where we try to stay happy, healthy, and productive. So, Arden, what are we talking about today?
Today, we're talking about everything to do with letters of recommendation. When you need a letter of recommendation, who you need to ask for the letter of recommendation, how to ask, which is the trickiest part, when to ask relative to your deadline, and then what to provide. What does your recommender need from you in order to write a great letter of recommendation? And hopefully, we'll cover lingering questions along the way.
Right.
If you have questions after this conversation, then you should leave them in the comments and then we will be able to respond to them. Dennis, maybe you can start by telling us what situations do you get asked to write
Uh,
letters of recommendation?
sure. I have to tell everybody letters of recommendations, you end up not just writing them, you end up requesting them at all stages of your career. And from being an undergraduate to graduate to faculty to senior faculty, it never stops, just even asking. And I have to tell you, I personally, it's my least favorite thing to ask. I don't mind writing them at all, but asking for them, being dependent on someone else, and you feel like you're imposing, and it feels like a big favor. So I understand the anxiety, or at least it brings me deep anxiety asking for recommendations. So let's talk about how to maybe lessen that anxiety. But I think the first thing is already what I said is that just know that it's a normal part of academic life. We all are expected to write these letters. Frankly, these days I'm much better at writing them. I think I write better recommendations these days and quicker, and it's totally normal. I have people from undergraduates to graduates to colleagues who are in the everyday running of the university, need letters, ask for letters, and I ask them as well.
Yeah, I myself have been in the position of having to ask for letters of recommendation countless times, countless different kinds of opportunities, and not always the same people because the rate recommender for one particular gig is different from a recommender for another one. If you are an undergraduate or a graduate student asking for a recommendation letter for the first time, not to worry. We've been through it so many times ourselves on the asking, and we can understand and sympathize with your request. So this gets us to when do you ask for a letter of recommendation? When people approach me for letters of recommendation, I appreciate it a lot when I have ample notice. Often I'm asked to write letters of recommendation for medical school when people
Yeah.
are applying in the next cycle of medical school, which might be a year away. So a year's notice is it's appreciated, but it's not necessary. That's a long time. Certainly I would need more than a couple of weeks notice because I'm balancing different kind of writing assignments and responsibilities. Target window for me would be like 1 to 2 months. Does that seem reasonable to you, Dennis? Or what do you prefer?
Yeah, I think much earlier than a couple months. It may be a little bit premature, and your materials may change enough. And I think also 2 weeks is the shortest possible. Now, have I written recommendations on a shorter time scale? Yes, but I was slightly grumpy about it. I would never write you a bad recommendation because you asked in the last moment, but it also just means I can spend less time doing so. So a couple months to a couple weeks, that's your window. I think the confusing thing or the thing that it's really important to get it right early is that so let's say you're applying to graduate school or to medical school or to a job is that you're sending the job a packet of all sorts of different information. It's your CV, it's your research statement, it may be other materials, it may be a portfolio. But the thing is, and let's say your deadline is in January. But the thing is, your recommenders can write a better letter of recommendation if they also see at least the major parts of that packet. So, really, even though your deadline is pretty late for the application, you want to be ready much earlier, at least with some drafts, so that you can contact your recommenders early already with the list of where you're applying and with some materials, with your CV, with your statement of purpose, with your portfolio, so that it helps me write a better recommendation letter for you.
Yes, I cannot emphasize this enough. It's very helpful to receive materials that are actually specific and tailored to what you're going to be submitting because we can refer to them in the letter. If you say, I need a recommendation for graduate school, but I don't know what my research is going to be about, it's very difficult for us to write. with specifics about your intentions. But if you're able to give at least working job materials or application materials to us when you first ask us to write the letter, that's incredibly helpful for us to write a good letter. Now, how do you choose which professor to write your letter of recommendation? This is always a tricky one. And students may have a different perception on this than faculty members do, because in your life as a student, you have many professors. So there seems like a lot of professors in the world. At the same time,
Right.
your professor has also spent considerable time with you in the classroom. So you might think you know them very well and that they would therefore be good. And you might think that they also know you very well, but that's not necessarily true. You may know them and have a kind of social, parasocial relationship with your professor, but they may not know you as well as you know them from your experience in the classroom. So often I find it's helpful if people ask me for a letter to have a chance to connect with the student again in a short meeting at a minimum, or,
Yes.
just to try to get a sense of who they are and what their plans are.
That's such a good tip. I'm a big fan of personal face-to-face meetings. So even if it's 5, 10 minutes where we can reconnect, say hello to each other, and you can explain, listen, I'm applying to law school and I took a class with you last year. And in that class, there was this great project that I did. And you remind me how we know each other and what kind of work we did together. And then it also gives you a chance to tell me what you want me to highlight. Obviously, my letter of recommendation for law school is different from medical school, is different for graduate school. And I do also want to say that what makes a good letter of recommendation is specificity. My job is not just to be like, hey, Arden is genius, she's brilliant, she's hardworking. I'm going to put something like that in. But as usual with good writing, show, don't tell. I want to say Arden is brilliant because, and then I want to give examples. We worked together in this project. We wrote together. She changed my mind about some interesting topic. And that detail, I might not always have that detail from last year. You took a class with me. There were 100 undergraduates in that class. And yes, at the time, maybe we did a cool project together, or I gave you comments on a paper that you wrote. But I also had 100 other students. So I really need to, in preparation for writing a letter, I need to pick up the documents that I had from last year and really try to remember specifics, not just the fact that you're a nice person and that you're smart. That's a given. But I need like details, I need projects. And therefore, the thing you can do to make your recommendation letter better is to send me that reminder to say, Dennis, we worked last year. Be specific. Don't just ask to say, I'm applying to this in this school. Say, I'm applying to this school. I really want to highlight my academic work from that semester. I wrote a paper with you on this topic, and this paper made this and this contribution. Let's chat for a couple of minutes and I'll remind you in person. And that's how we started.
Mhm. So I want to share a story of a student who asked me for a letter of
Oh,
recommendation not too long ago for a medical school application. The student had taken a class with me a few years previously, so it had been some time since they were in my class. And the student had been one of the quieter but highly intelligent, highly achieving
hmm,
members of the class. And so came around some time later to ask me for a letter for medical school. And I asked the student, can you please send me the papers that you wrote for my class? I always ask for that because it's very
right.
helpful to
Nice.
refer back
Yes.
to what they actually did, and then you can really talk it. But I also said, we really need to meet because it's been a while and I need to understand what you've been doing since then. And it turned out the student who had been a quiet member of class had gone on and founded a startup and invented a technology and done all these
Oh,
incredible,
wow.
which I had no idea of from the time that they were a student class. So sometimes if you've really achieved something since being in the professor's class, it's helpful to give that information to the professor so that they can talk about what you've done since then and the trajectory that you have. Um,
Right.
so that
Yeah.
situation where at first I was a little hesitant, thinking, I'm not sure I can write a very specific letter for this person. And then was completely dumbfounded by their incredible contribution and then could write them an incredibly strong letter. So I think, again, specificity and pointing to the excellent achievements in class and that since class is finished, that can really help. Uh,
Right.
yeah.
That's such a cool story. Yeah. I find it's challenging when often so a student will take a class with me in the fall, let's say, and then in 1 year, next fall, they're asking me for a recommendation. And of course, since then they maybe did some internship or they founded a company. That's a really neat story.
Yeah.
But also remember, the thing is, when I write a recommendation, I usually at the end have like a standard paragraph where I say, and since this amazing work they did with me, they did this and this cool thing. But here's the deal is that I can't really cogently speak about the new thing.
That's true.
Right? So let's say if you did a startup, I can say I am really impressed that this work has translated. So that paragraph is usually fairly short. It says that this person is on a amazing trajectory, and I'm paying close attention to their work, and I'm available for advising. But at the same time, I can't really. And even if you send me a lot of information about like your last year's internship or something, that's really where I can speak with most detail and precision is your work that you did for a class. And so it's still the case that, so I often do have students who say, can you please highlight my professional experience here or there? And I say that that part is probably better for your supervisor.
Mhm.
What I'm going to speak is to your work ethic and to your participation and to the quality of your work in my class or through our advising experience. So that's a great story that unfolds the complexity of that engagement. Arden, let me say one more thing.
Sure.
This also reminds me a story is the importance of having a diversity of recommenders. So normally you're asking several people to write recommendation letters, and it may be that you're asking a faculty member and somebody professional. And then somebody else, maybe a peer who worked with you and who can speak to your ability to work in groups. Point is, you just remember our conversation about graduate school and advising and finding a diversity of advisors. You want to find a diversity of recommenders who speak to different aspects of why you're so awesome, right? You don't want, if it's just like three faculty members who taught a very similar class, guess what? Their letters are going to say the same thing. This person was smart, they showed up on time, they worked hard, and they wrote an amazing paper. But maybe they can't really speak to some other aspects of your profile that you want highlight. So think about diversity, diversifying your support group. That's going to be a theme, I feel like, in our many of our talks.
I think so too. At the same time, as you're choosing a faculty member to approach to make the request for the letter, you should make sure in your mind that what they can speak to really does apply to the opportunity that you're applying for. So there have been times when, for instance, a student in engineering might want a letter from me
Right.
where it's not actually germane at all to the content of the opportunity. And I also might not know the student very well. So then I think, why are they asking me? I'm not really the right person to write
Yeah.
the letter of recommendation. So think carefully about what you want the letter to be doing to highlight some aspect of your overall intellectual profile.
Arden, let me ask you. So, do you ever say no to writing for someone?
No. Oh, I should admit that on the interview.
No, but that's okay. So you try.
No, but what I have done is in cases where I was doubtful about the quality of the letter I could write,
Right.
that I would urge you to consider asking somebody else. Yeah.
I am glad that you bring this up. So this is also it should help reduce the anxiety maybe that some of our students feel about asking is that we want you to succeed. So primarily, when somebody asks me for a recommendation letter, I'm not going, oh my God. And no, I really want you to do well.
Mhm.
When my students do well, it gives me meaning in professional meaning in life. Like I feel great. So just remember, we're on your side. So and oh, by the way, that brings me to another point. If I wrote for you and you got that job, you got that internship, please write to me and say, hey, I got this because it totally makes my day. But it also should make you feel less stressed out. Like it's normal to ask. We get asked all the time. And frankly, though it's not like a fun thing to do, but I enjoy it. I want to support your career. And but it also means, like Arden was saying, is that even sometimes I have a student who comes in and I don't know them very well, and maybe they weren't very vocal in class. We didn't really work together. I still want them to succeed. And it's difficult for me to say no. And I will, 9 times out of 10, figure out how to support that student. I
Mhm.
will, but it also, listen, it means that you have to do a little bit more work. You have to come in, and that initial conversation that we have has to be longer. I have to review your materials. I have to become more familiar so that I may have that specificity in writing, because I never like it's more difficult to write like a fake letter. It's more difficult to fake enthusiasm for someone than to actually be enthusiastic. So like when I take you on as somebody who I'm going to write for, I truly try to become enthusiastic about what it is you're doing. And that's, I hope that's what makes for a good letter. Right. So that's about, yeah, but saying no is hard. I do sometimes say no.
Mhm.
And actually, I think it is important to say no sometimes, because it also should, I think, our students should know that if I don't support you, I will actually tell you. I'll say, I'm sorry. I'm not, probably I'll try to be nice about it, but I'll say, I'm not the best person to write for you. And maybe I'll try to suggest some other people. The fact that your advisors do have the option to say no, that also means it's okay to ask. The worst thing that can happen, somebody will say, I can't do it, I'm too busy. No, actually, wait, the worst thing is if they never respond.
Oh, yeah.
So, what's your advice? So, let's say you asked your professor for a recommendation and they just you never got a response. So, what is your strategy? Do you email again? How often? How do you
Great,
feel about
great
that?
question. The good thing is you're doing this ahead of time because you followed our advice. You're not stressing too much because you still have time. After, I would say 1 week, you can send a very short follow up, not a nagging follow up, but just an informational follow up. It often happens that our inboxes are completely buried with new things, and we've seen your message. We just have not yet had the opportunity to answer. So sometimes having a reminder can be helpful. A very polite, short reminder 1 week
Right.
later, I think is fine. Perhaps one more after 2 weeks, and then you should certainly move on to the next person. But
Right.
here's a situation where you never want to be. You do not want to ask somebody for a letter of recommendation, have them write it, and then tell them you don't need it after all. Don't tell them at the 11th hour that you don't need it anymore because they've
Right.
done the work for you.
I think you make a great point. This is, I think, another maybe theme for our conversations is you really got to stay human. Remember, you're not dealing. This is not like a customer service representative. Well, actually, no. Customer service representative. You should treat them humanely. We're not a robot. We're not. So to write a good letter, it actually takes hours and hours. Especially the first one. I create a file. It's digital these days, but I have a file where I collect everything and I take notes. And so the first time you ask me, I'm going to create a new file for me. It's going to easily could take half a day, half of my day. It could take of the full day, depending if it's a short. Some of the undergraduates recommendations, they're applying for 10, 12 sort of awards or something like this, or internships. And this will be a couple paragraphs. If somebody's going for a job, this is a letter that's reviewing it's reviewing a dissertation, it's reviewing articles. And so just remember that we are putting in serious effort. Yeah. And if you like at the last moment, you go, just kidding, that doesn't feel great. That does make me think also that, let's say if you need 3 letters of recommendation, I would probably recommend asking 4 people early on, and in the worst case, submitting 4 recommendations. You want to avoid the situation where you are now 2 weeks away from your deadline and one of your letter writers didn't write or never responded to you. That just happens. It's normal. And some people are in various state of busyness. So having a plan B in some way, what do you think about it? Or does it put too much extra work for the community?
I think it's not unreasonable to expect.
Mm,
I think if you are a PhD dissertation writer who needs letters of recommendation, it would be completely reasonable to expect your dissertation committee to produce letters. It would be very strange if they did not. It's one where
yes.
they really need to step up. If they're not ready for you, then there may be bigger problems in play. If you're an undergraduate student and you need some letters of recommendation for a job or for a graduate school application, there it's a little bit less obvious who would be writing the letter, and therefore you may have to spread out a little bit further
Right, right.
and have
Yeah.
a few alternates that you ask, and you still have enough time ahead of the deadline.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't maybe do that for, again, if you're applying for like an internship or there's lots of these internal college sort of things where the recommendations are just, they're just an indication of faculty support. But for, let's say for an academic job, so I can tell you what I did is, so for when I was applying for jobs, often they ask for 3 letters of recommendation. And I kid you not, I sent 7. I asked and asked for 7, but not just because it's to show off that I know this many people, is I really asked people from very different parts of my life. Because part of my work is computational, part is scholarly, part is teaching. I asked somebody who can speak to my teaching. I asked for a recommendation who can speak to my computational work. And just it turned out to be like that's point is you want to think about what, especially at the high level, you want to think about the impression you're creating, and you want different aspects of your profile to be vouched for by different people.
So this actually brings us to an interesting gradation within recommendations more generally.
Yeah.
From the point of view of the recommender, it's very helpful if when you say, I need a recommendation, may I please have a recommendation? If it is a letter of recommendation, or if you just need to put our contact information into a form and have people reach out to us,
Right.
it's incredibly helpful if it's the latter, if you just tell us that, are you willing to be contacted? Because then I don't spend time producing a letter of recommendation that I might not actually need to submit. So if you, as the applicant, are able to differentiate between contact information for a recommender versus letter of recommendation needs uploading, that's really helpful for me to know. Other differentiation that's important to establish is whether this is a tailored letter of recommendation or a general letter of recommendation. If you are applying to medical school, you might be applying to all medical schools in the United States. And therefore, I don't have to speak specifically to how you would fit at an individual medical school.
Right.
Yeah, but if you are applying to a particular graduate program, like we talked about before with graduate school applications, I really do need to know which one it is so that I can refer to your strengths and your match with that program. I think the more clear you can be about the type of recommendation that's required, the better. And then we can tailor the letter in consequence.
Wow. Yeah. Look, there you bring up several important parts here. So first, remember that these days recommendations requests are going through all sorts of automated systems. So it may be that you put someone's name in the system and then the system generates a reminder email. That reminder email may end up in somebody's spam box because it's automatically generated. So I think that already opens up a can of worms, a few cans of worms. That's not even a saying. It opens up a can of worms. But what you bring up is make sure that sometimes you're just putting in a name for potentially being contacted, and that's different from putting a name so it generates a request. So understand the kind of system that you are and understand the requirements quite clearly. Now, I have to say, and this may be addressed, often we do this to ourselves. Often we will have a job search and we will ask for letters of recommendation, and there's 400 people that apply for a job. But really, we only need to see recommendations from like the top 12 candidates. The increasing trend is to just have the names
Uh-huh.
as you said, and then wait until this last stage. And in the last stage, then to say, okay, you made it to the final round or whatever, to the penultimate round. And then can you now send us the recommendation letters? And I think that what that does is it takes down the 380 people didn't have to write, or actually more times three, right? They didn't have to write. So that reduces the demands in the community. So what I would also urge hiring committees, I would urge our colleagues and those that sit on review boards for grants, etc., to be mindful of the labor, this whole dance that we dance and the game that we play, to really be mindful of how much labor it produces for everyone. But that's not really the concern of a student. That's really thinking about how some of this is self-inflicted.
Mhm.
Let me ask you, Arden, in when you review stuff, when you have a chance to look at people's applications, is it so important? Like how much does a good review letter? Does it matter really? Like you said, yeah, for a medical school, is the board actually like reading, every letter and like reviewing, going, oh yeah, this person wrote a great paper in their freshman year or whatever.
That's interesting. Okay, so I can't pretend to know how medical school admissions work from the end.
Right.
From cases where I have been involved in selection, which is not medical school, recommendation letters were important, as you said, with the final crop of candidates. The first pass of review would be, this ties in well with our conversation on graduate school admissions, would be reviewing CVs and research statements first. Those would carry more weight to see what kind of scholars and then how do they fit in and what are their intentions? Can they write well? Can they write clearly? Do they have an interesting idea? And then after figuring out that stage with those materials, then you might look at the letter of recommendation to see what does another person think are the top qualities in this candidate? What are their outstanding attributes? And can they tell some interesting stories about them that help to round out the portfolio? Maybe there's something that in the application it doesn't really make sense, but is only explained by the letter of recommendation. So I would say that they play an important yet secondary purpose to the primary documents in an application,
Yeah.
which would be the research proposal or the job letter of interest if it's a professional job, and then the curriculum vitae or the resume. Now,
Yeah.
some industries are putting aside letters of recommendation entirely. And within, for example, some tech companies, they no longer ask for or read or even allow their staff to write letters of recommendation because
Right.
they've moved on as letters of recommendation.
Yeah.
So there may be some industry level changes that will
Mm.
occur, but for now, at least academia, it's still very much rooted in letters of recommendation at every step.
Yeah. Put it nicely, important but secondary. So I think when I review applications, yeah, I always start with a statement of purpose or research statement and the quality of the work, if
Mhm.
there's any portfolio attached to any writing materials. But then in second, third, fourth order of importance, I will dip into the recommendation letters. And it doesn't matter for me. So often I will see names I'm familiar with, so
Mhm.
there's scholars that either somehow I've intersected with them during a conference or I read their work. And so when I see a scholar that I recognize, it's not because I know them or know their work. It's because they're strengthening the impression that this person is working on this topic
Mhm.
and they had someone who can vouch to the quality of their work.
But let
Yeah.
me ask you this, and this is one of the questions that keeps me uh,
Uh huh.
tormented. To what extent does it matter if you are asking a famous person to write a letter of recommendation?
Mm,
And I have actually been on this on the reviewing end where you might see some letters of
yeah.
recommendation, and then one of them, surprise, surprise, is by an extremely famous person. To what extent does that matter? And then conversely, if you are asking somebody without much professional clout to write a letter for you, but they write an
Right.
amazing letter, to what extent does that matter?
No, so I think it's a great question. It also I'm also worried about this, but it goes back to that notion of diversity. You want a diversity of recommenders. So if having someone who is a recognized, they don't have to be famous, but if they're a recognized name in the field, that's good. Now, the compromise, it's not a formula, but the rule of thumb is somebody who is senior and who is a recognized name in the field, they're advising many people. They're much busier, so maybe they're not able to write a tailored recommendation. A more junior person may have worked with you, they gave you more time, they know you work more intimately, and they will write a different kind of a letter, and both are useful. And both are useful. Also, remember that we, as faculty members, as just members of the academic community, we have a fine tuned sense of smell
Yeah.
for basically BS. And for there are the type of student that really chase what's the modern parlance? Chase clout. So
Yeah.
if you're chasing clout and you're just trying, you're like, I'm just going to get top 4 people in my department, or like just really famous people in my university, to write for me. First of all, it's very likely that some of them, you can tell that, oh, this person doesn't really know them. They just asked them and they got this very generic sort of letter. I would rather get a amazing letter from somebody who's more junior than a generic letter of like one paragraph from some famous person. So again, it goes to diversity. But also, you can't remember what I said. As a letter writer, actually, as a writer of any kind, you can't really fake this stuff. You have to ask people with whom you have a genuine connection. And that's what makes for a good letter of recommendation, right? And it's very likely that maybe you interacted with someone who's more senior and more established and some junior people, and that's the normal profile. So I actually, as a reviewer, I want to see, think about this. I'm not just, I'm not just like reading the content of the letter. If I'm looking at what kind of colleague, what kind of a community member are you? And I'm looking through the recommendation letters. I'm seeing like how did you navigate this stressful and complex place? And the fact that you have a good relationship with more junior colleagues. I think that's a great sign for me, actually. So I think it's great to have diversity, to be short about it.
Yeah. Yeah. I am happy with that answer because that's the conclusion I come to myself. Okay. I want to just reemphasize one of the points you made before. Please,
Mhm.
your letter writers know the outcome of your application. This
Right.
is really essential on both ends of it. On the first end, let us know if you have put our name as your recommender. Some people might just put a name and then we might get a surprise request. That's no good for us. And then on the other end of the application, once it's all through, we actually are invested in you. We're invested in your journey. We would like to know the outcome. Sometimes I receive, and it's my first day at medical school, and I just wanted to let you know it all worked out. And thank you again. Letter of recommendation. Like that makes my week. Send it to
That
me.
is super.
Like,
Partial.
it's no
Yes.
idea
Yes.
what my works, right? Otherwise, it's like a complete black box for us where we might not have any sense of if our letters are having any effect. So please let us know the outcome and keep us posted because we are human and we would like to
Yeah.
with you.
A-
Yeah.
And it really is often this relationship, they are career long relationships. So somebody who, especially, I mean, it's less so for undergraduates. That happens if an undergraduate is going exactly into my field. I may end up reviewing your tenure portfolio, or I might up reviewing your book. So it's another thing to think about is that it's not just you're not asking for a one time favor. You're continuing a relationship that's hopefully a career long relationship. And so there's an art to sustaining career, lifelong, professional sort of contacts. It doesn't have to be, don't go over the top. You don't have to be like effusive about it. But a thank you note and saying, I got this job. Thank you. Let's be in touch. That's amazing.
Yeah.
I have a wall, I have a magnetic board over there with lots of handwritten notes and like postcards and stuff like that. It's always appreciated. If you're doing something cool, let me know. If you wrote a book, send it to me. If you wrote an article, it's really neat to again to feel like the effort, like why is it pleasant? It feels great to know that the effort you put in actually resulted in
Yeah.
someone doing well. That always feels good.
Yes.
That's great. I think, Arden, I think there's probably more to say, and maybe we'll do a follow up
Mhm.
depending on the questions. I think that's a lot already to think about for one day.
Yeah.
So please be in touch with us. Go ahead and ask your questions in the comments, and we'll try to collect them. And when there is enough for an episode, we may do a follow up. Meanwhile, happy, healthy, and productive. Be well
Yes.
this fall, and hopefully, we'll see you soon.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Bye.